This story is going to hurt to hear. It's a really sad and tragic and angering story all at the same time. But it's a real story that happened to a real black family. Their pain and loss was real. This story has no happy parts or resolution. It only has trauma. But that is what black life was like for millions of black people during the Jim Crow era. And it's important that we tell their stories. It's important that we tell the stories of those that lived and died in injustice. We can't act like these atrocities didn't happen, because they did. This story is just one of thousands. We are all familiar with the story of Emmett Till. He was the 14-year-old black child who brutally lost his life after two white men, Roy Bryant and his brother J.W. Milam, lynched Emmett for whistling at Roy's wife, Carolyn Bryant. She made the entire story up. These men kidnapped Emmett, and they beat him, and they took his life, and threw him into the river. They were later acquitted. Emmett's mother, Mamie Till, allowed pictures to be shared in Jet magazine of her son's open casket. It sparked national outrage and helped to bring attention to the civil rights movement. Mamie let the world see what happened to her son because she wanted everyone to know how black people were treated in this country. She wanted the world to know that justice did not exist when it came to black people and black children. In this video, I want to tell you about another black child who suffered a similar fate, 11 years before the world ever heard of Emmett Till. Only his mother and father didn't get to share what happened to him with the world. His death didn't help to fuel the movement. He was just one of thousands of black victims who suffered at the hands of a Jim Crow mob. Before I get into the story, I want to give you some historical context and background. This information is going to help you understand the story I'm going to tell you about. So give me a few moments to break this down, and then I'll tell you what happened to this black child. During the Jim Crow era, black children lived in two worlds. In one world, they were children, being cared for and nurtured by loving parents. They enjoyed playing and having fun. In the world of being a child, race was not a factor. It was not present. At home, black children were not black. They were just sons and daughters. They were grandchildren and nieces and nephews and cousins. But in the other world, the one dominated by caste and racism, black children walked right alongside their parents and elders who were forced every day to walk a racial tightrope, always making sure to be subservient and accommodating and contrite to whites. Black children who saw their fathers command respect within their house also saw and mimicked him as he got off the sidewalk when a white person walked by. The danger of living in these two worlds was that it provided no protection or safety for black children. Sooner or later, an explosion was going to happen. At home, a mistake by a black child was met with warmth and with correction. But not in the other world. A mistake was met with brutality and injustice. The problem with living in these two worlds is that the world dominated by race and segregation was going to enter the world of innocence, and it was going to destroy it. And black children lived with this every single day, being aware of this threat, being aware that an explosion could take place. Social scientist John Dollar said that the threat of lynching was likely on the mind of black children from their earliest days, and that this was the reality for black children during the Jim Crow era, and in many ways, still today. It was the clashing of these two worlds that destroyed the Howard family in 1944 in Live Oak, Florida. Live Oak is the county seat for Suwannee County. It's an interesting place with an interesting history. After the Civil War, Suwannee County had black elected officials. 9 black men served on the county commission between 1870 and 1877. It had 2 black justices of the peace and even had a black postmaster from 1889 to 1905. But that changed with the end of Reconstruction. Suwannee and Live Oak was like every other southern state, driven by the Jim Crow racial code, with black people being on the bottom rail of society. And it was also not without its share of racial violence. 6 black men were lynched in Suwannee County between 1890 and 1900. In 1891, a black man named Charles Griffin, he was lynched after he was accused of being involved in taking the life of a sheriff's deputy. A mob tied his hands and feet by a rope to a post and whipped him and fired at his body until he was dead. In 1894, a black man named Coot Williams, he was lynched after he was suspected of taking the lives of 2 white women. He escaped from the prison during this time, and 2 white women lost their lives. People assumed that he did it. He was later captured and returned to prison. 100 white men took him from a prison camp and lynched him. In 1898, a black man named Arthur Williams was lynched in Live Oak after he was accused of violating and taking the life of a white woman. He was taken from the jail by a mob and also lynched. Now, let me tell you about the Howard family. James Howard was born in 1909 in Thomasville, Georgia, to James Howard Sr. and Maybelle Butler. His family had been farmers. In 1918, he moved to Live Oak, Florida. In September 1927, James married Lula Figgs. Lula was born in 1909 and she was from Lake City, Florida, near Live Oak. It was a community of black landowners and farmers. The next year, in July of 1928, James and Lula welcomed their first and only child, Willie James. James and Lula were hard-working black people. James worked for the Bond Howell Lumber Company. Through hard work, James and Lula managed to do something that not a lot of black people did back then, and that was to purchase their own land. By 1944, James, Lula, and their only child, 15-year-old Willie James, lived a good life for a black family. They were well respected in the community. Willie was a good kid. He attended Douglas High School. It was the all-black school in Live Oak. Everyone in school liked Willie. His classmates said that he was jolly and lovable, and his family felt the same way. At home, he was called Giddy Boy, because that's what he was. He was a happy child. He was always singing a song or whistling a tune. He enjoyed being a child. And it's important to remember this as I tell this story, that Willie James Howard was a child. In the fall of 1943, Willie got a job. He worked at Van Priest's Dime Store. It was a small store in Live Oak. Willie worked there with other black boys. He would come after school and on the weekends and he would clean up and take out the trash and restock the shelves. Willie really liked his job. It was not farm work, which could be grueling, and it was also a position that put him in close proximity to whites. Now, this was both good and bad. It was good because he was not doing the backbreaking work of farm labor, but it was bad because anything that Willie did could be seen as offensive to the whites and could land him in serious trouble. When school let out for the Christmas holiday in December of 1943, Willie started working at the store full-time. Now, remember I said that Willie was known to be a likable kid who enjoyed people. Well, his kind-hearted nature would put him on a collision course with Jim Crow. Willie decided to give Christmas cards to all of his co-workers at Van Priest. He thought it was a nice idea and a nice gesture, and he didn't think he was doing anything wrong. He was wrong. One of the people he gave a card to was a white 15-year-old girl named Cynthia Goff. She worked at the store as a cashier. Willie and Cynthia were both about the same age, worked at the same store, and were both in high school. But there was one thing that made them different, and what Willie did a capital crime. That was that he was black and Cynthia was white. Willie attended the all-black Douglas School, and Cynthia attended the fully funded all-white Sewanee High School. Their separation was not meant to be only in education. It was meant to be in all areas of life. And Willie broke this rule when he gave her that Christmas card. It didn't matter that they had worked together at the same store and saw each other all the time. He was never to cross that racial barrier that Jim Crow put in place. And he made a mistake when he did this. And Jim Crow and racism did not care about the kindness and innocence when it came to black people. And Willie was about to learn that lesson. Cynthia came from a very prominent white family in Live Oak. Her father, Alexander Philgoff, had been a member of the Florida House of Representatives, and he later served as a postmaster for the Live Oak Post Office. He was also a member of the Masonic Lodge. Her mother, Mary Goff, ran the family's boarding house. This was a well-to-do white family, and they saw what Willie did as not just an attack on their little girl, but also an attack on their family. And this had to be dealt with Jim Crow justice. After Willie handed out the Christmas cards, Cynthia became upset. When Willie found out that he had upset Cynthia, he tried to calm the situation, but this only made it worse. He allegedly wrote another note to Cynthia, trying to explain himself. This is what Willie allegedly wrote to Cynthia. I say allegedly because the original note is not available. What we have is what the police included in their report. Dear friend, just a few lines to let you hear from me. I am well, and hope you are the same. This is what I said on their Christmas card. From Willie James Howard, with love. I hope you will understand what I mean. That is what I said. Now please don't get angry with me because you can never tell what may get in somebody. I did not put it in there myself. God did. I can't help what he does, can I? I know you don't think much of our kind of people, but we don't hate you all. We want to be all your friends, but you won't let us. Please don't let anybody see this. I hope I haven't made you mad. If I did, tell me about it and I will forget about it. I wish this was a northern state. I guess you call me fresh. Write me and tell me what you think of me, good or bad. Sincerely yours, from Willie James Howard. For Cynthia Goff. I love your name. I love your voice. For a sweetheart, you are my choice. Whether that was the actual note that Willie wrote to Cynthia, we don't know, and we never will. There are some questionable parts to it, but this is all that we have to go on. There are some in Live Oak who said that Willie did not write a love note to Cynthia, but rather he wrote down the lyrics to a song called If This Ain't Love, It Will Have to Do Until Then. Remember, Willie liked to sing songs. Some said that Willie was singing the song at work and Cynthia asked him to write the lyrics down for her. One Live Oak resident, Detta Haynes, she recalled shopping at the Van Priest store during this time and hearing Cynthia ask Willie to write down the lyrics to a song. Willie did not respond to her and kept doing his work. However, no matter whether it was a song or a note that Willie wrote down, it doesn't matter, because what happened next, Willie did not deserve. The fact that Willie had written anything to Cynthia that could be perceived as intimacy was a crime of the Jim Crow South that was punishable by death. Willie broke Jim Crow's #1 rule, and that was a black male getting too close to a white female. Cynthia's father, Phil Goff, moved quickly to carry out Willie's punishment. Goff enlisted his neighbor, Selden McCullers, and Selden's brother-in-law, Reginald Scott, to help him carry out Jim Crow justice on Willie. Goff told the white man how Willie had written his daughter a note and Willie was getting fresh with her. This was all these white men needed to hear because they showed no hesitation when carrying out what was going to happen next. On the morning of January 2nd, 1944, Goff, McCullers, and Scott went to the home of Edward McPherson, who was the principal of Willie's school. They asked him to give them directions to Willie's home. He told them how to get there. That morning, Willie was still off from school for the holiday break. He was at work at Van Priest's dime store when someone told him that the white men were looking for him. Willie quickly ran home as fast as he could and told his mother that these 3 white men were trying to get him to take his life. Before Lula could do anything, a car pulled up in front of the Howard's home. Out came Goff, McCullers, and Scott, and they did not come to talk. Their plan was more brutal and more sinister. Phil Goff approached the Howard's home. Lula met him outside. Goff asked her where James was. Lula told him James was at work. Goff then asked her where Willie was, and they needed to talk to him. That's when Willie came outside. Goff quickly yanked Willie off the porch and towards him. Lula tried to protect her son and pulled him back towards her and the house. That's when Goff reached into his pants and pulled out a weapon and pointed it at her. She was staring down the barrel of his weapon. She had a choice to make. Fight, and maybe both she and Willie die right there, or allow them to take Willie and maybe she can get help. She stopped fighting the men, and she released Willie and let him slip from her grasp and into theirs. The white man quickly pushed Willie into their car and drove off. I can't even imagine what she must have felt. This is a parent's worst nightmare coming true. And it's easy to say what you would have done, but that's not fair to Lula and the situation. This was a time when it meant nothing to lynch a black person. Those men would have had no issue striking down Lula right there and then striking down Willie. No one would have blinked an eye and done anything to them had it gone down like that. Lula was in an impossible situation, one that I nor you would ever want to be in. After the men left with Willie, Lula ran to her sister's home, which was a short distance away. When she got there, all she could do was pace back and forth on her sister's porch. Her niece, Corinne Dunbar, asked her Aunt Lula what was wrong and where Giddy Boy was. Lula said that 3 white men took him. Lula knew she had to get to her husband James. He was at work at the time. Lula rushed to the Bond Howe Company where James worked to tell him what happened. When she got there, Lula learned more terrible news. She was met by the mill owner's wife, Mrs. Howe. She told Lula that James was not there. The same white men that took Willie had come and taken James as well. Things had gone from bad to horrific. That day, James was to assist his boss, R.L. Howe, with the inventory. Later in the morning, when he was working, Phil Goff came to James' job and went to talk to his boss. Goff said that he needed James to come with him on business. James' boss let him go with Goff. When James got to Goff's car, he saw his son Willie sitting in the back seat with McCullers, who was holding a weapon. James didn't know what was going on, but he knew it was not good. James got in the car with his son and the white men, and they drove off. The white men drove James and Willie down Sewanee Springs Road, and then they turned on a dirt road that led to the Sewanee River. James tried to talk to Willie, but Goff told him to shut up. It must have been terrifying in that car. This is what I meant earlier when I said that black children lived in 2 worlds. Willie was in the car with his father, the man he looked to for protection and guidance, but in the face of Jim Crow terror, Willie was no longer a child. In that car with the white man, Willie's childhood and innocence was stripped away from him. He and James were no longer father and son. They were two black men. Once at the river, Goff stopped the car and he ordered Willie and James out. Goff and McCullers then got a rope from the trunk. The two white men then tied Willie's hands and his feet. They then made James guide Willie to a spot a few feet from the edge of the river embankment. It was on that spot that the three white men became the law. They were the deciders of who would live and who would not. Justice, due process, and the rule of law did not apply to Willie and James. In that moment, their fate, like so many black people before them and after them, was in the hands of a Jim Crow mob. Goff asked James if he approved of what they were doing to his son. James said he did not. Goff then asked Willie if he knew the penalty for his crime. Willie was crying and he was scared. Through his tears and his fear and his terrified, shivering voice, Willie told Goff that he understood. Goff then went to stand behind Willie and the other two white men stood next to James. James tried to plead with the white men for his son's life, but he was told to shut up. Phil Goff turned to James and told him to say his final words to his son. Faced with the certainty that he could not save his son, he could not protect his boy, and there was nothing he could do to stop what was about to happen, James mustered the courage and the strength to give his son comforting last words. He said, "Willie, I cannot do anything for you now. I'm glad I belong to a church and I prayed for you." And that was it. Those were the last words that James Howard spoke to his son. Willie asked his father to take his wallet. After the father and son spoke their last words to each other, Phil Goff looked at Willie and asked him how he liked to die. He said, "You can either jump into the river or take what was in his weapon." Willie chose the river. Willie backed off the edge of the bank and fell into the water below. As he did this, James watched as his son slipped into the deep. The men wouldn't let James go into the water to try to save Willie. After it was over, the three white men made James get back in the car. They threatened him with their weapon and said that if he said anything that was different from what they said, then he would be next, and it would be their pleasure to give him the same fate as Willie. The men then took James back to work. Lula was waiting for James when he returned with the white men. She was hoping he had good news about their son, but he had the opposite. She pressed James for answers about what happened and where Willie was. James stayed silent. He was afraid to tell her what happened. Finally, he said to her, "Willie is not coming home," but he could not muster the strength to tell her what happened. James drove Lula home and then he went back to work. It wasn't until several days later that James finally told Lula what happened at the river. When James arrived back at work that same day, he was met by Live Oak Police Chief William Hunter and a man named Wiley Bird, a local man who was a former police officer and was no friend to black people. They told James to come with them. The men then took James to the courthouse where they were met by Sheriff Tom Henry and Phil Goff, Seldon McCullers, and Reginald Scott. The three white men told the sheriff what they claimed happened at the river. They said that they did not harm Willie and their only purpose was to have Willie's father James punish his son for writing that note to Cynthia. The white men said that they helped James punish Willie by tying his hands and his legs to keep Willie from running off. They said that when James began to punish Willie, Willie became upset and he was irate. They said Willie did not want to be punished or humiliated like that and said that he would rather die than to be beaten by his father or the white men. The white men said that Willie then moved away from them and went close to the edge of the riverbank. They said James did not try to stop Willie and Willie then jumped into the river. After the white men made their statements, James Howard was forced to sign the affidavit as well, acknowledging that this is exactly what happened and it was the correct version of events. Later that night, the sheriff came back to James and Lula's house and told James to come with him. James was taken back to the courthouse. Goff was there along with H. Hare Jr., the tax collector for Suwannee County. James was made to sign another statement saying that he did not want a coroner's jury to investigate how Willie died. By 8 p.m. that night, Sheriff Henry had reported this incident to State Attorney David Lanier. The cover-up moved quickly. The next morning was Sunday, and as the citizens of Live Oak attended church, many had no idea what was about to be revealed. But soon, word began to spread, and that was that Willie James Howard was dead. The town's black undertaker, Ansel Brown, he was summoned to go and retrieve Willie's body from the river and to prepare his remains for the funeral. After Willie's body was prepared on Sunday, the next day on Monday, Willie's classmates were allowed to view his body before it was quickly buried. There was no dignified send-off for Willie, no ceremony, no service. just a quick and rushed burial that his parents James and Lula did not attend. Live Oak was not safe for James and Lula Howard. James was with the white man when they took his son's life. He knew what happened. He knew that the white men were lying, and he knew that the sheriff conspired to cover it up. And as long as James was alive and in Live Oak, he and Lula would never be safe. 5 days after Willie was lynched on January 7th, James and Lula packed up their things and sold their home and moved to Orlando. Remember, this was 1944 in Jim Crow, Florida. No one was coming to save black people from injustice. And even though black people were upset about what happened to Willie, there was not much they could do. The sheriff and the police chief were the main participants in this cover-up. Who were James and Lula going to tell? Who in Live Oak was supposed to help them? There was no one to tell. And even if they wanted to write to get the word out, they could have easily been discovered. Phil Goff was the postmaster and could intercept their attempts to bring attention to the case. It was a completely helpless situation. The press in Florida did not even cover Willie's death. The local paper in Suwannee County did not mention it at all. No one cared to say anything about the atrocity that had occurred to this black child. But a word did manage to get out, only it came from outside of Live Oak. Soon Willie's case got the attention of the NAACP. Black attorney Elbert Robinson worked in Washington, D.C. He would go to Florida for Christmas. While in Florida that year, he learned about what happened to Willie James Howard, and he wrote to NAACP Executive Secretary Walter White, and he told him about Willie's lynching. And he said that black people in their area were afraid to talk about what occurred, and that help was needed. It wasn't just Attorney Robinson who notified the NAACP. A black man named Robert Jackson, he wrote to Walter White informing him of what happened to Willie and asking that they look into it. A black man named A.L. King, he wrote a letter informing him about Willie's death. G.L. Porter was the principal of Lincoln High School in Tallahassee. He wrote asking for an investigation. And other letters came in from Florida from black people hoping to get attention on what happened to Willie James Howard. They all reported the same thing, and that was that black residents of Live Oak were terrified, but that something needed to be done about what happened. Soon, Thurgood Marshall got involved. He wrote to the governor of Florida, Special Holland. Marshall asked the governor to open an investigation into Willie's death. With all of the mounting pressure, the governor agreed to push for an investigation. On February 12, 1944, Governor Holland wrote to Thurgood Marshall, and in the letter, he let him know that Willie's death would be investigated and that he had requested that State's Attorney David Lanier convene a grand jury to look into what happened to Willie. Thurgood Marshall also wrote to Florida Senator Claude Pepper. World War II was ongoing, and Marshall invoked patriotism in his letter. He said the fight for freedom abroad was just as important as the fight for freedom at home. Marshall reminded the senator that the War Department had just released stories of how white American soldiers had been tortured by the Japanese in Philippine prison camps. He said that what happened to Willie James Howard deserved the same level of attention. Pepper responded by saying that he had not heard of Willie's lynching and therefore he would not say anything about it publicly. Even though the NAACP was trying to bring attention to what happened to Willie, James and Lula were reluctant to speak out. Getting help from the law did not seem like a path to justice. It was law enforcement who covered up what happened to their son, and the threat of death was still present for James and Lula. The governor assured the NAACP that James will be protected when he testified before the grand jury. However, the governor was not hopeful that the grand jury would do anything. He wrote to Thurgood Marshall, let them know that it was unlikely that a white grand jury would take the word of a black man over 3 white men. As the weeks went by, James and Lula grew determined to get justice for Willie, and they were joined by other black leaders in Florida who stood by them during this time. In Orlando, the Howards lived with Reverend R.H. Johnson, who was the vice president of the Orange County branch of the NAACP. The Howards were staying with Reverend Johnson when State Attorney Lanier came by to interview them on February 6, 1944. The Howard family was also helped by Harry T. Moore. Harry T. Moore was the president of the Florida NAACP. Harry T. Moore is a forgotten civil rights leader. He championed the rights of black Floridians, and he was actually the first civil rights leader to lose his life for the movement. His home was bombed on Christmas Day in 1951. The blast took Harry and his wife Harriet's lives. Harry had grown up outside of Live Oak and went to school with Lula Howard. He was angry about what happened to Willie. After Willie was lynched, he wrote to Roy Wilkins, who was one of the leaders of the NAACP National Office, urging support for Willie's case. However, to his surprise, the National Office had already known about the incident. He also arranged for James and Lula Howard to speak at the NAACP Board of Directors meeting in March of that year, so they could tell everyone what had befallen their family. They wanted to spread the word about what happened to Willie to anyone who would listen. The grand jury was convened and began proceedings on May 8, 1944. But the grand jury did not intend to take this matter seriously. James Howard was present and ready to testify. He sat there all day and watched as the grand jury called every case but the one pertaining to his son. After waiting for hours, James approached the bailiff and presented the subpoena that he had been given to appear. The bailiff then gave it to Sheriff Henry. This was the same Sheriff Henry that was a part of the cover-up. The sheriff looked baffled and asked James who gave him that subpoena. He then took the subpoena to the state attorney, David Lanier, and demanded to know if he knew about it. Attorney Lanier said that he was aware of it. The sheriff became visibly upset and began pacing the floor. James was eventually called to testify. He told the grand jury how the three white men kidnapped him and Willie. He told them how they were forced to go to the river. He told them how they made his son jump into the water to his death. The only questions the grand jury had for James was what was Willie's age and whether Willie had given that note to Cynthia. And with that, James was dismissed, and no other witnesses were called. The state attorney asked the grand jury to indict the three men for taking Willie's life, but that didn't happen. No one was ever indicted or held accountable for what happened to Willie James Howard. Harry T. Moore continued to ask the NAACP National Office to put pressure on authorities to bring charges. Thurgood Marshall, he wrote to the U.S. Justice Department asking for assistance. Harry T. Moore also wrote to the Justice Department. He wrote several letters asking for an update. He knew that justice was needed if black people were going to be protected from Jim Crow mobs, but he got no response. And Harry T. Moore was right to be concerned. 1 month after he wrote his last letter to the Justice Department about Willie's case, another black person lost their life in the same way in Florida. 63-year-old Sam McFadden was a World War I veteran. He got into an altercation with Constable Tom Cruz in which Sam cursed at the white man. Constable Cruz took Sam to the river and beat Sam with his pistol and a cowhide whip. He beat Sam so badly and then forced Sam to jump into the river. And just like in Willie's case, no charges were brought in Suwannee County. The white constable was later charged federally, but only for violating Sam's rights, not for taking his life. He was convicted and sentenced to 1 year in prison and a $1,000 fine. The very next month after Sam McFadden was lynched, in October of 1945, another black man, a black sharecropper named Jesse James Payne, he was lynched in the neighboring Madison County. Jesse asked to be paid in advance on his crop, and for this, he was lynched. We've actually done a story on him, so check it out if you haven't seen it already. After over a year of lobbying for help and demanding that charges be brought against Goff and the other white men, the U.S. Justice Department wrote back in September of 1945 saying that they found no basis to bring a federal investigation or prosecution for Willie's case. And just like that, it was over. No one was ever held accountable. This incident haunted the Howard family. This is not the kind of injustice you just move on from. They took James and Lula's only child and no one did anything about it. Even in her old age, when talking with Lula, she would break down crying and talk about how they took her child. And James suffered in silence for the rest of his life. He was present when they took his son's life, and he was powerless to do anything. He lived with this pain and shame until he died. The Howards lost everything. They lost their home, their peace, their dignity, and their only child. All because of a note passed between two children. Racism and injustice stole everything from them. This is what life was like for millions of black people. Your humanity did not matter. Your status in the community did not matter. You couldn't build up credit and goodwill with Jim Crow. And for Willie James Howard, his youth and his innocence did not matter. When Jim Crow came looking for him, there was nothing that anyone could do to stop the outcome. In the days after Willie's lynching, everyone else went back to normal. Sheriff Henry and Selden McCullers went out of town together the next week. In that same month, Sheriff Henry ran for re-election. He told the citizens that he had been fair to everyone and did unto others as he would have them do unto him. As for the Goff family, nothing changed for them. The brutality they visited upon Willie did not stop the Goffs from having a swimming birthday party for Phil Goff Jr. at the Suwannee Springs where they forced Willie to jump to his death. As for Cynthia, she had a great school year. She was elected junior class president. James died a few years after he and Lula moved to Orlando. Lula died in 2004 at the age of 95. For 60 years, Lula lived with the pain of what happened to her family. This is something you think about every day. You don't just move on and get over it. While the men who caused this pain and took her child lived good lives. Phil Goff died in 1969 at the age of 70. Selden McCullers died in 1968 at the age of 67. Reginald Scott died in 1983 at the age of 79. These men all had children and grandchildren and lived respected lives. Cynthia Goff was able to live a long life. She married a man named Homer Blankenship in 1948 and had a child. She died in 2011 at the age of 82. Willie didn't get this. He never got a chance to enjoy life. He was robbed of the opportunity to get married and to have children. He never got to mature into a man. His life and his future was stolen from him. This is what life was like for black people. Injustice everywhere. You could not escape it. Best intentions and kind hearts did not matter to Jim Crow. All that mattered was your race. If you were black and made one mistake, it meant a death sentence for you. It didn't matter if you meant well. Your race canceled everything, including your life. I want to know your thoughts on this story. Had you ever heard of Willie James Howard, and how did it make you feel learning all that he and his family went through? Leave me a comment down below and let me know your thoughts.